Okay, in this section we'll talk about speciation and strains of the cannabis plant. We will review how cannabis fits into the botanical family, and we'll introduce a few of the common cannabis strains that you might see out on the market right now. So our three species are Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Cannabis ruderalis. And they each have different features that we'll look at in just a moment. Some botanists still suggest that Cannabis indica and Cannabis ruderalis are subspecies of Cannabis sativa. So in some books you may see it shown as Cannabis sativa sativa, Cannabis sativa indica, that kind of thing. Early in the 18th century, cannabis classification was based on whether the plant was wild or cultivated. And so early classification of cannabis, Cannabis indica was considered the wild plant, and the cultivated plant was called Cannabis sativa. However, that kind of classification was kind of rejected. Linnaeus, who's the Swedish botanist, he's credited as kind of being the father of modern taxonomy, and taxonomy is just how plants are classified into families and genres, those kinds of things. And he suggests that all of cannabis belonged to just that one species, Cannabis sativa. And he added that L after it as his last name, Linnaeus, to distinguish the change. So often you might see Cannabis sativa L, and that's just because the botanist wanted to put his sort of mark on it. The original species of cannabis, it's basically all but lost to antiquity because it has been on the earth long before humans have been on this earth. So we really don't have that original species. Cannabis is one of those plants that very easily will cross-pollinate within the same family. So even if you're just growing a bunch of plants out in your own field and you have 3 different strains, they may end up doing some cross-pollination if you get a male plant in there. So today we can consider all cannabis plants as being some type of hybrid of those original genetics. Now, what we do have is what some people call original genetics, but they're not original. They're just sort of original since people have kind of been starting using them in modern day. And these are called the land race species, or land race cultivars, land race strains, they're also known as. So basically, landrace refers to cannabis strains that have been grown in isolation for a period of time, for a longer period of time. So they didn't cross-pollinate with other species at all. Some might have escaped cultivation and then just kind of took on a life of their own out in the mountains or in the woods where humans didn't really pay attention to them for a while. There's a really interesting documentary on Netflix that you can find that talks about the search for some of the really old strains in Colombia, and that's an interesting one to go look up. So often these landrace strains were named for the region where they were found or where they kind of grew in. So there's Afghani, Thai, Maui from Hawaii, those kinds of things. They are today kind of considered like the most purest form of the original cannabis genetics, but again, we don't really know how pure they are to the original plant because they just no longer exist. And a lot of those landrace strains, especially since the 60s, 70s, 80s, when cultivation of cannabis was really just to kind of bump up the THC amount in there. So we've lost even some of those landrace strains. So when you hear people talking about, cannabis today isn't your grandfather's cannabis from the 70s or the 60s, there's actually some truth to that because back in, the 60s and 70s, a lot of those strains of cannabis didn't have really high THC in them. They had more equal amounts of THC and CBD, so what we would consider now to be more of a balanced strain. And but then through the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was in vogue to have really high THC, and so a lot of the breeders and the growers were sort of choosing the strains that were really high in THC. And so we lost some of those original ones that were considered, you know, the sort of milder versions that we had back in the 70s. What today are considered landrace are actually valued for breeding new cultivars. So as we go through some of the cultivars that we're going to look at in a few minutes, you'll see that some of them might have come from some of these landrace strains. And some of it is just hearsay. A lot of the growers didn't keep really good notes on their genetics. Some of them did, some of them didn't. And I would say that, you know, some of those grandparents out there may still have some of these seeds from these original landrace strains from the 70s and maybe even into the 60s sitting in the back cupboard or in a garage somewhere. Every once in a while someone will email me and say, oh, my grandpa or my dad or my uncle just found these old seeds that are from the 1970s in their garage. Are they going to be viable? Are they going to work? It's like, throw them in the ground and see, right? So there's some interesting strains out there, and we may get a better handle on it as we start genetically typing the different cultivars, and maybe we'll be able to kind of trace them back to some original strains, or maybe we won't, I don't know. Okay, so some cannabis terminology. The word strain refers to a cannabis variety that has been undergoing scrutiny for the past few years. So you might find some hardcore cannabis people out there that say, we don't call them strains anymore, we call them cultivars. So industry is really starting to prefer the word cultivar or variety over the word strain. So technically the word strain really relates to a plant that has undergone some sort of genetic modification. But in general terms, we don't really refer to it that way. So a lot of people in a lot of stores and growers will still refer to them as strains. Cultivar really refers to a cultivated variety. So cultivar, cultivated varieties, where that word comes from. So that means they've been specifically selected and cultivated and bred or improved upon for various traits by humans. So humans have specifically gone in there and made these changes in order to, or selected for different traits in the cannabis in order to get the different cultivars or varieties. And varieties technically refers to variations found in nature, so just as plants will evolve or change over time with no human intervention. So that's kind of the technical term for those three. In the industry today, you're going to hear them referred to as strains, you'll hear them referred to as cultivars, and you'll hear referred to varieties. All three are correct, and occasionally if you use the word strain in a group of really hardcore cannabis people, they might sort of go like, don't use that word, that's not technically correct. So, so just that's where we are with that kind of technology there. Chemovar or chemotype, these are also interchangeable terms, and this refers to identifying differences in cultivars based on the chemical profile. So that's when we actually do a chemical analysis of the plant and we look at differences that happen in there. So chemically analyzed plants that just aids in the understanding of physiological effects that the plant may have. This will come into play more and more as we do more of that research into medical use, because when we're talking about medical use, we really want something that's very precise and very consistent over time. And so that's when that chemical analysis of different plants is really going to come into play. Plants can have very similar chemical makeup, but their appearance can vary greatly. And that's really just due to growing conditions. It might have got different light. The two different plants got different light or different watering, different soil. Those kinds of things can happen. When we know the chemovar of a plant, especially medical users, as we said, we're better able to select the products that are going to be very similar to that. This is one of the areas for medical users, especially before we had required testing and disclosure of THC and CBD amounts in the different strains is a medical user would just have to rely on whatever their grower was growing for them. They didn't really have a lot of choice. And so they might have a product that really helps them sleep, and then the next batch that they get is from a different cultivar, a different strain, and it doesn't help them sleep at all. So some of you students may have actually experienced that or know someone who's experienced that. There's a specific product that's on the market, works really well for someone, and then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, that product is no longer available and they have to try a different product that doesn't work as well. So this is knowing the chemovar, the chemotype of a plant is really going to be very important as we are using these products for medicinal purposes. The two most common chemotypes that we have right now are THCA predominant and CBDA predominant, and we'll learn more about what that means in a minute. So we had chemovar and chemotype, and now we have genotype and phenotype. So genotype is the genetic makeup. So if we were to actually look at the DNA of the plant, that is our genotype. The phenotype refers to differences in expression of the same genetic material. So that's what's going to happen is if we have the same genotype, but they're grown in different conditions, that may produce some subtle variations in the same plant. So as I was talking about earlier, different levels of light or intensity of light, outdoor grown versus indoor grown, the soil or humidity, how the plant, when the plant was harvested, how much air circulation there was. So those are all the things that can change, make slight variations in a genotype that are just due to the growing conditions. So you've probably heard the terms indica and sativa. As we talked about earlier, the cannabis plants were thought to be indica plants, sativa plants, and then we have this, what's sometimes called the scrappy little cousin, rudialis. But originally it's thought that the two different sativa and indica were actually physically different plants. So sativa grew quite tall and spindly, where the indica plant was a little short and bushier. The leaves were wider on the indica, and on the sativa plant, the leaves were more elongated and quite thin. We still see those variations in the different plants, but we can no longer say that this is definitely a sativa plant or this is definitely an indica plant, because as we just learned about, there is no such thing anymore. They're all hybrids. So how we're using those terms now is to more refer to the effect of the plant when the plant is consumed or is inhaled or however it's taken into the body. So indica tends to be, if something is classified as an indica plant or indica dominant is another way that it's talked about, is it's tends to be a little more calming, a little more muscle relaxing, tends to work a little bit more on the body area, and this would be the trait that you're looking for if you're looking for instance, something to help you with sleep, because you want that muscle relaxing to happen. A nickname for indica strains is indicouch, because typically the indica strains are something that would kind of have that couch lock effect where you sort of feel like you're kind of stuck in the couch. You can't get up because your body is so heavy and relaxed. Sativa, on the other hand, is a more heady, so it affects the mind a little bit more rather than the body and the muscles. For some people, a sativa plant actually wakes them up, is very uplifting, it helps to lift mood, is very energizing for a lot of people as well. So those are, the nickname for sativa is sunny sativa. So we have indicouch indica, sunny sativa, which kind of gives you an idea. And if I just go back a slide, there's something that is an old idea about, is called the doctrine of signatures. A lot of people in the scientific community think that that's all just woo-woo, the doctrine of signatures, but it really talks about, it's this idea that when you look at how a plant grows, you can kind of tell the effect it will have on a body. So a really great example of this, if you look at a walnut plant, and if you open up a walnut, that walnut looks like a little brain, and we know that walnut oil, or walnuts have an oil in it that is really high in omegas, that is really excellent for brain health. So if we apply the doctrine of signatures, for whatever it's worth, to the sativa and the indica plant, with the sativa plant, traditionally it grew very tall and spindly. It was kind of reaching up to the air, and we know that the sativa effect is kind of heady. It kind of affects the brain. It's uplifting. It sort of brings you up. It might even make you a little more lightheaded, or that traditional kind of stone feeling. Where the indica plant is shorter, it's closer to the earth, and we know that the indica effect is a little more heavy. It brings you down into the earth. So those are just some fun ways that we can remember the different effects between the indica versus the sativa. So to summarize, the little mantra that you can remember is sunny sativa, indica indica. And here's a nice little chart, and this kind of summarizes the sativa effect versus the indica effect. So sativa tends to be quite stimulating, where indica is a little more sedating. Sativa is uplifting, indica is more relaxing. Sativa can be very energizing. Indica is much more calming. In sativa, that's where we get that kind of cerebral, the headstone kind of thing, the head buzz. With the indica, it's more felt in the body, more of the body buzz going on. With sativa, for some people, they can get quite focused with sativa, but other people get a little bit spacey, or people who tend towards maybe being a little bit hallucinogenic, those kind of things can start to happen, where indica is more just that couch lock feeling where you just feel like you can't move. You're so relaxed, you just don't want to move. Sativa tends to be more suited for daytime use for most people, where indica, because it is so relaxing, body relaxing, tends to be a little bit more better for most people to look for that indica effect at night. Okay, so let's talk about traditional strains now. As we mentioned earlier, the origins of the original strains are long lost to antiquity. But what we do have are what considered traditional strains. They may or may not be considered landrace strains, but these are some of the traditional strains that have been around in the industry, have been kind of popular, or people really know these strains and look for them, or look for traits of those strains. And so this would be a good thing to know, especially if you're working retail, because in a retail setting, you're not able to talk about the medicinal qualities of the plant. So if we can if people know that medicinal qualities of Acapulco Gold, then they're going to come into a store and say, I want something that is like an Acapulco Gold. So let's go through. We're not going to go through a ton of them. We'll just go through a few traditional strains. Now, this is also a little bit subjective, this information. So what I've done is I've compiled the information from a few different sources that I find to be quite reliable, that you can find on the internet. Now, and those are Canna Connections, Leafly, Medical Jane, and WikiLeaf are some of the ones that I've gathered. So you may come across other information that talks about maybe slightly different traits of some of these strains, but again, a lot of this is quite subjective. And so what I did is I went across several different areas and tried to compile the most common traits that we find in those. Okay, let's start with Acapulco Gold. Acapulco Gold originated in Mexico, and you can tell by the name Acapulco. This one is considered a more pure sativa type strain, so heavy on the sativa effect. So quite heady, more for daytime use, stimulating, energizing, those kinds of things. It's used, a lot of people will use this for anxiety, to help with anxiety. It's quite energizing. A lot of people find this works really well for headache relief and for just kind of that uplifting feeling, or if you just need to kind of pull yourself out of a little bit of depression, those kinds of things. Acapulco Gold might be a good one for that. Afghani strains, of course, originated in the Middle East. And this one is kind of opposite of Acapulco Gold. It's considered very indica dominant, or more pure on the indica side of things. And so as we just learned about indica, we're going to use that for relaxing the muscles, to help with chronic pain, to help with fatigue, because it's going to help you sleep a lot better, help with relaxation, fibromyalgia, those kinds of autoimmune issues this might work really well for. And it's a very relaxing strain as well. The next one we'll look at is Colombian Gold, and obviously that one is named after Colombia, the country where it was found. Strongly sativa dominant, so we have a lot of those sativa traits in there. A lot of people really like Colombia Gold for focusing. If someone's suffering from ADD or ADHD, or just have a project that they need to really focus in on, it can help a lot of people with that. A lot of people actually like to use Colombia Gold as well if they're artistic, because it kind of helps to get them into sort of a focused artistic state. They also find it quite relaxing, but not relaxing in like an indica where it's going to put you to sleep, but just more getting rid of that anxiety type relaxation. And it's quite uplifting for a lot of people as well. Our next one we look at is called Northern Lights. This originated in the United States, and allegedly it's crossed with some of the Afghani strains as well. This one is strongly indica dominant as well, so we know that it's going to help with relaxation, muscle relaxation, pain. Some people find this one works really well for anxiety. And it can be stimulating for some people. So again, just because it's indica doesn't mean that it's always, every indica is going to put you to sleep. This one can help with sort of uplifting a little bit and manage stress a little bit better as well. That's Northern Lights. Our next one is called Haze, and this might have just Haze in the name, so there might be a lot of different strains out there that have the name Haze in there. This one originated in California. This is a strongly sativa strain, so again, used for more daytime use, very uplifting. It helps with chronic pain. Now, if you have chronic pain that needs to be managed during the daytime, but you don't want to fall asleep, then you might want to find a sativa strain that's going to help you with that pain during the daytime. And then you'd have a more indica dominant strain that's going to help you sleep at night and be muscle relaxing. So again, we may have different products that we use for different times of the day. But Haze is typically thought really great for chronic pain, very energizing. And a lot of people find this one works really well for those migraine headaches. Either to stop the migraine headache from kind of taking hold, or from finding relief from a migraine headache. Our next one we're looking at is skunk, and again, we'll find a lot of products out there that might have the name skunk in them. That means that some of their origins come from these traditional skunk strains. It is unknown. Nobody really knows where this one originated. Again, strongly sativa dominant, so really used for helping people who need to focus, maybe the artists or a writer who really need to focus on things. This one, a lot of people like skunk for socializing. It tends to be kind of relaxing, getting rid of anxiety, a great one that people like to socialize with, and it's very uplifting, so it can kind of bring you out of a mood, sort of bring a little bit of giggles and happiness into your life. And the last one we're going to look at is sour diesel. Again, it's another one of unknown origin. If you look that up, you might find some really fun stories about where that one came from, but nobody really knows. There's no consensus on that one. It is another strongly sativa dominant product used for, this is a really good one for people who need to stimulate their appetite. It's very energizing. It's also relaxing without sedating. So that's really good for daytime use. It helps with pain and very uplifting, like a lot of the sativa ones are. Just kind of gives you a feel-good mood type of thing. So that's sour diesel. So let's just sum this all up. We have all the strains there in this little table that we have here, and their places of origin, whether they're sativa or indica dominant. Now, remember, we're referring to not whether the plant is a sativa strain or an indica strain. What we're referring to is the effect that it has on the body, whether it's that sativa uplifting effect or whether it's a more an indica, sort of relaxing, heavy kind of a feeling as well. And then there's a little table there that's sort of a quick reference, so you can look at what a lot of people are using it for. So you can use this table as a nice little quick reference. There's lots of these type of tables out there that you can find as well. And so you can always go look those up in books and on the internet.